On the morning of January 28, 1944, roughly 56,000 German soldiers woke up surrounded. Soviet forces from 2 Ukrainian fronts had closed the ring at Zvenigorodka, trapping elements of 6 divisions in what would become known as the Cherkassy Pocket. Stavka wanted another Stalingrad. Hitler wanted them to hold in place. And the men inside had maybe 3 weeks before ammunition and food ran out entirely. The force sent to break them out was built around 80 Panthers and Tigers, commanded by a former dentist. And what those tanks went through in the mud of central Ukraine is one of the most intense armoured engagements of the entire war. So today, we're covering the full story of Heavy Panzer Regiment Bäke, what happened when they tried to punch through the Ukrainian mud, and why 80 of Germany's best tanks still couldn't save 56,000 men trapped in the Cherkassy Pocket. To understand what Bäke's regiment was sent to do, you first need to understand the mess that created the mission. By January 1944, the Eastern Front in Ukraine was coming apart. The Soviets had crossed the Dnieper in force the previous fall, and the German defensive line that was supposed to hold along the river had already been broken in multiple places. In the central part of Ukraine, 2 German corps found themselves stuck in a salient that jutted out into Soviet-held territory, west of Cherkassy. General Wilhelm Stemmermann's 11th Corps and General Theobald Lieb's 42nd Corps were holding ground that made no tactical sense anymore, but Hitler refused to authorize a withdrawal. On January 24th, the Soviets launched their operation to cut them off. The 1st Ukrainian Front under General Vatutin pushed from the north, while the 2nd Ukrainian Front under General Konev drove up from the south. 4 days later, on January 28th, the 2 Soviet pincers met at Zvenigorodka. The ring was closed. Roughly 56,000 German soldiers, including the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking and the Belgian SS Brigade Wallonien, were trapped in what the Germans would call a Kessel, and the Soviets were already comparing to Stalingrad. Stalin was delighted. Konev reportedly wired back that the encircled enemy would not escape. And for the men inside, the clock was now running. The man chosen to lead the armoured spearhead of the relief effort was a 45-year-old reservist named Franz Bäke. He'd been a dentist in civilian life, called back to service in 1939 at age 41. By late 1943, he had over 400 tank combat missions, 7 wounds, 13 tanks destroyed under him, a Knight's Cross with oak leaves, and a reputation for leading from the front in the lead tank. By December 1943, the army asked him to build a regiment from scratch and take it into combat within weeks. Heavy Panzer Regiment Bäke was formed in late December 1943 under the staff of Panzer Regiment 11. The composition tells you everything about how desperate the situation was and how much the Germans were willing to bet on this single unit. The regiment combined 2 of the most powerful tank types Germany had. The Tiger Battalion came from Schwer Panzerabteilung 503, one of the most experienced heavy tank units on the Eastern Front, with 34 Tiger 1s. The Panther Battalion was the 2nd Battalion of Panzer Regiment 23, fielding 46 Panthers. Supporting them were self-propelled artillery, a mechanized engineer battalion with bridging equipment, and eventually a mountain infantry battalion for close support. 80 tanks total. That was an enormous concentration of armour by January 1944 standards, when the entire German Eastern Front was running on fumes, and every single one of those tanks was either a Panther or a Tiger. No Panzer IVs filling out the ranks, no Stugs rounding out the numbers. This was the heaviest armoured fist the Germans could assemble in the southern sector, and they handed it to a 45-year-old dentist from Hagen. And among the Tiger crews of the 503rd was a 22-year-old Sudeten German named Kurt Knispel. He had been fighting in tanks since Barbarossa, first as a loader, then as a gunner, and by 1944 was one of the most prolific tank gunners on the Eastern Front. He had fought at Kursk with the battalion and reportedly destroyed 27 Soviet tanks in 12 days during that battle alone. He was recommended for the Knight's Cross multiple times and never received it. By the end of the war, he would be credited by some accounts with 168 confirmed tank kills, which would make him the most successful tank ace of the entire war. Now, before we get to combat, you need to understand what the Panther was actually like to operate in January 1944, because on paper, this was one of the best tanks in the world, and in Ukrainian mud, it was something else entirely. The Panther weighed about 45 metric tons and was powered by a Maybach 512, producing roughly 690 horsepower. It carried one of the finest tank guns of the war, the 75mm KWK-42 with a barrel length of 70 calibers, which could punch through the frontal armor of virtually any Soviet tank at combat ranges. The frontal hull armor was 80mm sloped at 55 degrees, giving it effective protection, equivalent to well over 100mm. On paper, it was faster, better armed, and better protected than the T-3485 it faced. But the Panther had a fatal weakness, and Ukrainian mud was about to expose it. The problem was the final drive. Germany didn't have enough gear-cutting machine tools to mass-produce the planetary gear system the design originally called for, so production Panthers got a simpler double-spur gear final drive made from steel that wasn't really suited for the job. Pivot turns could snap it outright, and when it broke, you couldn't just swap it. Crews had to disassemble the entire driver's compartment and lift out the transmission, a workshop-level job that took the better part of a day. By the end of 1943, Panther units on the Eastern Front were averaging roughly 37% operational readiness. Out of every 10 Panthers, only about 4 were actually running at any given time. Engine life averaged around 1,000 kilometers, and alloy shortages were making gears more brittle with every production run. So when Bäke's Panther Battalion rolled into combat, they were carrying the best gun and frontal armor Germany could produce, mounted on a chassis that might decide to break itself at any moment. The regiment's first major action came almost immediately. From January 23rd to roughly January 31st, Bäke's force operated under the 46th Panzer Corps in the Uman and Vinnytsia area. Soviet armored and mechanized units had pushed deep into German-held territory, and Bäke's regiment was thrown in as a mobile fire brigade. The fighting centered around the Balabonovka Pocket, and Bäke used the same approach he would repeat throughout the campaign. He let the Soviet spearheads push forward until they were overextended, then hit them in the flanks with his Tigers and Panthers simultaneously. The Tigers would engage from long range, their 88mm guns picking off T-34s at distances where the Soviet tanks couldn't effectively return fire. Once the Soviets reacted and tried to maneuver, the Panthers would swing around and catch them from the sides. It was a brutal combination, and in the open steppe around Balabonovka, the Soviet tankers had very little cover to hide behind. Over 5 days of intense combat, the regiment reported destroying 267 Soviet tanks and assault guns, along with 156 anti-tank and artillery guns, for the loss of 4 Panthers and 1 Tiger. Bäke personally destroyed 3 Soviet tanks at close range using infantry anti-tank weapons, not from inside his command tank, earning 3 tank destruction badges worn on his upper right sleeve. Even if those numbers were inflated, and wartime kill claims sometimes are, the results at Balabonovka were still devastating by any standard, and they demonstrated what concentrated heavy armor could still achieve when used aggressively against overextended Soviet spearheads. And now, the relief operation. Remember, 56,000 men are inside the pocket, and they're running out of everything. Manstein assembled 2 Panzer Corps for the rescue. General Bryth's 3rd Panzer Corps, including Bäke's regiment, the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, Heavy Panzer Battalion 506, and Stug Battalion 249 would attack from the southwest. The 47th Panzer Corps would push from the southeast. Together, they had roughly 260 armored vehicles, with reinforcements from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, and the 1st Panzer Division expected to add another 150. But before the first tank rolled forward, Hitler made a decision that cost them a week they didn't have. Instead of ordering a direct relief corridor to the pocket, he commanded the 2 Panzer Corps to counter-encircle the entire Soviet besieging force. Bryth argued against it. He wanted both corps concentrated for a single punch through to Group Stemmermann. Manstein initially sided with Hitler, though he had no real faith in the plan. So from February 4th to roughly February 8th, the relief force spent its strength attacking in the wrong direction, trying to achieve an impossible encirclement instead of driving straight for the pocket. When it became obvious the counter-encirclement had failed, Manstein finally redirected the 3rd Panzer Corps to attempt a direct relief, but the repositioning cost them until February 11th. 7 days lost. 7 days of ammunition, food, and morale burning down inside the pocket. The terrain was a nightmare. Central Ukraine in February meant temperatures hovering around freezing during the day and dropping well below at night. The ground alternated between frozen hard enough to support armor and thawing into bottomless mud that swallowed vehicles to their hulls. Roads were few and in terrible condition. The Gniloi-Tikich River, which the relief force needed to cross, had its bridges blown by retreating Soviet engineers. And here's the thing about operating Panthers and Tigers in these conditions. The deep black soil of central Ukraine, the Chernozem, turns into a thick, clinging paste when it thaws. Tanks that weighed 45 tons were sinking to their bellies. Recovery vehicles couldn't reach them because the recovery vehicles were getting stuck too. Panthers that threw a track in the mud required hours of work just to get the track back on, assuming the crew had the tools and the Soviet artillery gave them enough quiet to do it. And every time a Panther's final drive failed, that tank was done until a workshop unit could pull the entire transmission. In the middle of a relief operation with men dying inside the pocket, you didn't have days to wait for workshop repairs. You either fixed it in hours or you left it. One engagement on February 13th showed exactly how Bäke's regiment fought. Bäke's scouts spotted two T-34s concealed in an ambush position. Rather than send tanks into the kill zone, Bäke called in Stukas. The dive bombers hit the concealed positions and flushed the Soviet tanks into the open, where the Tiger battalion engaged them from roughly 2,000 yards. The 88mm guns on the Tigers were devastating at that range against T-34 armor. More T-34s appeared and attempted to outflank the Tigers, but Bäke's Panther battalion and Panthers from the 16th Panzer Division caught them from the side. Stukas continued working over Soviet anti-tank gun positions. Soviet resistance was ferocious. The 2nd and 6th Tank Armies and the 40th Army hammered at the German penetration from multiple directions. Every kilometre gained cost tanks, fuel, and time that the men inside the pocket didn't have. There was nothing left for the final push. When the fighting was over, the Germans claimed 70 Soviet tanks and 40 anti-tank guns destroyed for the loss of 5 Tigers and 4 Panthers. Bäke's tanks reached the Gniloi-Tikich stream and established a small bridgehead. That was as far as they would ever get. The men in the pocket would have to come to them. Manstein, monitoring the progress from the rear, radioed 3rd Panzer Corps directly. The message was simple. Despite the mud and the Russians, much had already been accomplished. Now it was about the last step. But that last step proved impossible. By mid-February, only about 7 kilometers separated the relief force from the edge of the pocket. 7 kilometers. You could walk it in an hour and a half on a good day. But between Bäke's tanks and the trapped men stood elements of Konev's most powerful formations, including the 5th Guards Tank Army, 3 additional armies, and the 5th Guards Cavalry Corps. Konev had stacked his strongest units directly in the gap, and he was preparing a final crushing blow for February 17th. The relief force simply didn't have enough left to break through. Panthers were breaking down in the mud faster than they could be repaired. The Tigers were burning through fuel at enormous rates on roads that were barely passable. The infantry needed to hold the flanks of the corridor were being ground down by continuous Soviet counterattacks. Leibstandarte, the remainder of the 16th, and the entire 17th Panzer Division were all committed just to keep the corridor from collapsing behind Bäke's spearhead. On February 16th, Manstein made his decision. Without waiting for Hitler's authorization, he radioed Group Stemmermann with 3 words: password freedom, objective Lysianka. The breakout would begin at 2300 hours. Stemmermann organized his men into assault wedges with 3 echelons. A bayonet echelon to lead the charge with no preliminary fire. A heavy echelon built around what few operational tanks and mortars remained. And a supply echelon of trucks and wagons. The objective was Hill 239, the receiving point where 3rd Panzer Corps and Bäke's tanks would be waiting. With extreme reluctance, Stemmermann left behind 1,450 non-ambulatory wounded attended by volunteer medical personnel. He ordered that violations of international law were not to occur under any circumstances. What happened next was not a military operation. It was a catastrophe in a blizzard. The first echelon broke through the initial Soviet positions, but the order of march collapsed almost immediately. 2nd and 3rd echelons surged forward together. 50,000 men crammed into a space a few miles square, all streaming toward the same handful of roads. Stemmermann's command half-track was hit by a Soviet anti-tank gun. He was killed instantly, along with his driver. The force that had been called Group Stemmermann 5 minutes earlier stopped existing as a coherent military formation. Soviet artillery and Katyusha rockets saturated the open ground. T-34s drove straight into the columns, crushing men, horses and wagons under their tracks. Cossack cavalry units swept in from the flanks with sabres. Men who reached the Niloy Tikich River found the bridges destroyed and the water freezing. The river wasn't wide, maybe 20 to 30 meters in places, but the current was strong and the banks were steep with mud. Trucks, wagons, and artillery pieces were driven into the river to form makeshift crossings. Trees were felled as improvised bridges. Hundreds drowned. Others died of hypothermia within minutes of entering the water. Wounded men who couldn't swim were carried across on the backs of stronger soldiers, many of whom went under with their burden. Bäke's tanks, positioned on the far bank near Lysyanka, provided covering fire for the scattered remnants still trying to cross, their guns the only thing keeping the Soviet armor from driving straight through to the river. By dawn on February 17th, 3rd Panzer Corps launched one more attack and finally secured Hill 239. Bäke's regiment could now cover the last survivors straggling across. Of the roughly 56,000 men originally trapped in the pocket, somewhere around 28 to 35,000 made it out, depending on which source you trust. The rest, roughly 19 to 20,000, were dead, captured, or missing. They came out without their heavy equipment, without their artillery, without their vehicles, many without their weapons. For the month of January 24th through February 21st, Bäke's regiment claimed approximately 500 Soviet tanks and assault guns destroyed for 9 of their own lost in combat. The Tiger Battalion lost 7 Tigers total during the Cherkassy fighting, but only 1 was confirmed destroyed by enemy fire. The others were abandoned after becoming hopelessly stuck in mud, their crews unable to recover them and unwilling to let the Soviets capture them intact. The Panther Battalion's losses were harder to track because so many of their casualties were mechanical. A Panther stuck in Ukrainian mud with a broken final drive was just as lost to the regiment as one hit by a Soviet shell. The difference was that one death was combat and the other was engineering. Bäke received the swords to his Knight's Cross on February 21st, 1944, the 49th soldier in the entire Wehrmacht to receive that decoration. His regiment was dissolved on February 25th. The component units were sent back to their parent divisions. Within weeks, many of the same men and tanks were trapped again in the Kamenets-Podolsky Pocket, where most of the remaining Tigers were lost. The German army called Cherkassy a victory. General von Vormann, who commanded the other relief corps, later said the troops who took part were astonished and unbelieving when they were told they had won a great victory. Konev was made Marshal of the Soviet Union for his role in the battle. Nobody asked the 20,000 men who didn't make it out what they thought.